Welcome to our discussion titled, Can't We Put the Clock of Global Warming Back? My name is Andreas Sternowski, and I'm a publisher at Continental Publishing House in Germany. It is a distinct pleasure for me to introduce Viktor Smetacek. Viktor is an oceanographer and has spent over 40 years as researcher and professor for marine biology at the University in Bremen and at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, Germany. He is a recognized expert in pelagic oceanography. Good evening, Viktor.
Good evening, and pleased to be here.
Our second guest is Peter Fiekowsky, the author of the book Climate Restoration, and which has just been published in German. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming. Before we turn to the question of whether we can restore the pre-industrial climate, first, the question for you, Peter. Is it necessary to make such an attempt?
Well, it's necessary if our intention is to make sure that future generations survive in a manner that we're familiar with. So the planet will do fine going forward, but if we want humanity to continue, then we probably want to set up the environment that our society is designed for.
In your book, you've described 4 ways in which we can remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Could you briefly introduce them?
Yeah, so the 4 methods, we haven't seen any besides these 4 that meet our criteria. And the criteria are that the solutions be long-term, be permanent, that the carbon is removed long enough to make the difference, at least 100 years, that they be scalable, but they get the job done, and that they be financeable, that there's a method of paying to have it happen. So there are hundreds of methods out there, and probably 3 new ones every day in the news. The 4 that actually fit those 3 criteria, the first one is one that Viktor has led in over many decades, and that is ocean iron fertilization. That's the method that nature uses to remove CO2 before ice ages. The second method is synthetic limestone, and limestone is the way that nature removes most of the CO2 from the atmosphere over the last billion years, and 99% of the carbon on our planet is in the form of limestone, which is almost half CO2 by weight. And then that can be manufactured. It's actually much easier than you might be visualizing. If you imagine an oyster and an oyster shell, the oyster is creating the oyster shell, which is limestone. And so doing that in a manufacturing plant is not rocket science. It's not easy, but it's not heavy duty. The third of the 4 is seaweed. And seaweed, again, Viktor is one of the leaders in that area as well. And seaweed is a variation on the ocean fertilization, which is phytoplankton, which is using the sunlight to photosynthesize, to run photosynthesis to pull CO2 from the air. On land, trees do that, but trees have the disadvantage that they die after a few decades, and then they almost always rot or burn. And this carbon goes back into the air. In the ocean, when the phytoplankton or the seaweed, which is macroalgae, when it dies and the animals that eat it die, they sink into the depths where there's not enough oxygen for it to rot. So those are the 3 CO2 methods. And then there's an important 4th one, which is methane oxidation. And methane has become more of an issue in the news over the last couple of years. it accounts for almost a fifth, almost 20% of all the warming that the greenhouse gases produce. More importantly for me, and I think for most of us who are either grandparents or potential grandparents, is the risk of a methane burst. That we've almost lost 80% of the polar ice cap, the floating ice over the pole, which reflects sunlight during the summer, and it's almost all gone now. That planet, there was massive melting of the permafrost, which released a vast amount of methane, and the sudden warming that caused the extinction of about a third of the species on the planet. And so we don't think it'll happen again. But on the other hand, theory is theory and history is history. Historically, the last time we lost the ice cap, it happened. So the methane oxidation, which is the fourth method, provides an insurance policy. So if the loss of the Arctic ice, which is expected in the next 10 or 15 years, if it triggers a methane burst like last time, then we can actually oxidize it before there's a massive ecosystem collapse. And we've done the math. It actually works out. It's amazing that we can provide that kind of insurance for humanity at such a low cost. We can talk later about the cost if we have time.
Victor, all of the natural processes mentioned have something to do with the oceans. Have we thought enough about the oceans when thinking about climate crisis?
What we know about the ocean now is that this is a fundamental new insight that we gained in the end of the 1980s. And it was the pioneer there was John Martin. But this is something that has been suspected for a long time, but couldn't be proved, that the ocean is limited by iron. So the productivity of the ocean depends on how much iron is available, because iron is highly insoluble. It's an element that is around which life has developed, because when life was evolved, there was a lot of iron around because the oceans and the atmosphere were reducing. So we had the iron in its ferrous form, which is iron 2. Now, when iron gets oxidized, it gets into the iron 3 form, which is in the presence of oxygen, it makes rust. And it's this rust which is highly insoluble. You know, if you get a rust stain on your clothes, the only way to get rid of it is to use the scissors, because you can't wash it out. So the same problem then arose when the oceans and the atmosphere became oxidizing after the photosynthesis was evolved by plants, what we later became plants. So this is the beginning of plant life. Now, this is also interesting because a lot of people are skeptical about it. They can't imagine that just one element could have such a massive control. But you know that iron also exercises a key role in our own bodies. That's the way the body defends itself against pathogens and other invaders. What the body does, what all organisms do, is they deploy a molecule called ferritin, which binds iron. And it prevents the iron from being taken up by the pathogens. So the reason, for instance, we don't get infections in the mouth, although we keep, when we brush our teeth, we always make little wounds with bleeding, but it never, ever becomes infected. You never get a little pus boil in your mouth because the bacteria there can't grow. They're limited by iron. So, so iron is the first line of defense that the body, iron withdrawal, removing iron, is the first line of defense that the body deploys to keep off parasites and pathogens, which is why there's only basically one serious parasite that grows in the blood, and that's malaria, right? And that's why it's such a problem, because blood and saliva, everything, these are heavenly for bacteria. It's warm, the food is there, you know, whatever you're eating, and it's just ideal, but there's no iron. and that's why things don't grow, right? So the malaria parasite has figured out where to get the iron from, and that's in the red blood corpuscles. So that's the cycle of malaria. The classic cycle is when the malaria parasite is injected into you by a mosquito, it goes immediately into a red blood corpuscle and grows inside, because that's a lot of iron, the hemoglobin, right? It then grows there, and then it expands. I mean, it multiplies, and then it goes back into the bloodstream where it cannot grow. And then from there, it goes back again into a red blood corpuscle. So that's the cycle of malaria. And actually, any kind of unicellular organism could grow in our blood, but they would die because they don't know how to get at the iron, right? So there's also this talk about meat-eating bacteria. You know, somebody came up with the story that they found this particular bacteria. It belongs to a very dangerous pathogen, which I just missed the name of this genus at the moment, but it's also responsible for cholera, for instance, right? And this particular bacterium has been reported on sargassum. Now, this bacterium is everywhere, right? And the fact that they found it on sargassum and multiplied it, you know, it was made big news. And that just goes to show that there are a lot of people out there who want to make scare stories about doing anything, meddling with the ocean, or doing anything, right? So they will look for any kind of danger that could potentially be lead to a disaster or something, right? And that's why geoengineering has got such a bad name for so long. We should have been doing many iron fertilization experiments, because iron, as I told you all, is a crucial element that is very quickly lost. So if you add iron to the ocean, it stays there for a very short time. I mean, it goes into the organisms multiply, and it's like watering a desert, you know, everything grows, but then that iron sinks out just like water also gets lost from the desert. It has to be replaced all the time. So iron plays a similar role. Well, you have to get our minds around it. It plays a similar role in the watery ocean, but also in lakes, by the way, that water plays on land. It's something which cannot be recycled properly, right? And the other proof of that is that 38% of the deep ocean sediment is called red abyssal clay. And this red abyssal clay has very little life. There's almost nothing growing there. The clay is actually dust, and it's the only thing that survives. It's a dust that settled over millions of years, and all the pelagic remnants that settled in the ocean, they all dissolved. They're not in the red abyssal clay. And what is red? Red is iron. So the iron is the only biogenic element that is removed, basically, and locked away in the sediment. So this red abyssal clay is also proof of the role of iron, that it's a kind of one-way street almost, and that these regions, the red abyssal clay regions of the planet, they are totally impoverished. There's very little life there. And that's exactly where we would then make in the form of depots this algal biomass that we would then compact and put down there. So we would not be losing valuable habitats, you know, which is also another fear, right? So I'm just telling you the fears now, because the denigration of iron on iron fertilization, right, is in the minds of everybody, you know, whoever, you know, all our friends and so on. I'm not my friends anymore because they know. But whenever I talk to strangers, they say, oh, you want to put iron in the ocean? Isn't that going to lead to toxic algal blooms and these meat-eating bacteria and this and that and so on? So I'm reminded of the medieval ages when there were ghosts everywhere, you know, where you had to be careful not to scare the ghost. The ghost might come and grab you. So this is the kind of aura that has been built around geoengineering. And it's maddening because we are in a crisis mode because of the CO2 and the methane, right? And it's these compounds that are threatening us, and not what might happen if we do something to prevent them from, to remove them from where they are doing their damage. So that's the situation. You see how exasperated I am, because it's, I know the ocean. I have spent years on the ocean, and I look at the plankton, so I know what I'm talking about. And who has done that? I have a handful of colleagues who have that knowledge. I'm sorry, but it is like that, If you somebody who, if you've been in, you know what you're talking about, and you have all these people who come up, in German we have a word, it's called Bedenkenträger. And there's no proper English word for it. It means somebody whose existence is to say, oh, what have you thought about that? Have you thought of that possibility? That's all that they're good at, and nothing else, right? They don't have alternatives. They don't really know what the problem is, right? So there's a whole lot of Bedenkenträger out there who have been denigrating the attempts that we would make to restore the oceans.
Yeah, if I can expand on that a little
Please.
bit. Yes. So about 8 years ago, I had a mission statement on my wall, which has been there for 20 years, saying that my mission in life is to leave a world that we're proud of to our children. And I thought that was a little bit arrogant, but I figured, well, it's better to be arrogant than resigned. And I was working on poverty and hunger, because that seemed immediate. And I realized by 2010, I was very clear that the problem at this point is the climate, that we're not going to be able to feed people because of the climate. And also population, which is another conversation and part of the book. In order to actually solve the problem, we have to restore the climate. For a long time, I'm a physicist, and I figured, well, let's understand the problem. Well, the opening for me was to discover that the science is fine with whatever happens. It's very exciting, and there's always going to be more science to be done, whether humans survive or not. And hopefully, if we don't survive, maybe the AI will keep doing the science for us. But that's separate. The three of us, we want our. I have 3 grandkids under 3 years old at this point, and we want them to be happy. We want them to flourish, and the only option is that gives us certainty is to restore a historically safe climate, which is getting CO2 down 40% from where it is now to what it was 100, 200 years ago. Technically, that means below 300 parts per million, which is the highest that humans have ever actually survived long term. And the options for doing that basically is just to do, as Victor said, is the iron fertilization in the ocean. There are other ththings that you can do which are vastly more difficult. The limestone, that I have a sample here of the synthetic limestone that a company that I sort of assist with here in Silicon Valley makes, and that's great, but it's much slower, much harder to do at scale. And the kelp and the seaweed, again, much harder and more difficult to scale. We have to do all 3 because our children are so important. There could be some reason that Victor and I cannot possibly imagine why the ocean fertilization won't work, in which case we need plan B and plan C. But the main thrust of this, Andreas, is updating our worldview. Because our climate worldview was formed around 1990, the late 80s and 90s, when a lot of the really great climate work was being done. And they said, the UN said, our goal is to stabilize greenhouse gas levels, which makes logical sense. It makes emotional sense, right? Because if you remember, the 3 of us are old enough to remember 1990 quite well. And if I ask people, what was the climate like? People look like me like I'm weird because we don't remember, because it was just the way it was. It's like asking what did you have for breakfast in 1990? It just was the way it was. It was just ordinary, and stabilizing was the emotional answer that the UN came up with. Well, it's 35 years later, CO2 levels are 40% higher than humans have ever survived, and we can see our ecosystems and our political systems collapsing in front of our eyes. And we just have to change the goal to say, oh, we want to restore it. restore and stabilize. And that's all we have to do, Andreas. As Victor pointed out beautifully, we have everything we need to actually do it. The cost is much less than $1 billion a year to implement it. Yeah, it's essentially nothing. And all it's missing, and the purpose of the book, is to get people changing the goal to restore and stabilize.
Yes, I think I can understand people fear something that is not which Victor research on extensively, but still it's not a commonplace. And but it seems to me that it would be a common sense just to start with it, and then to because we don't have time.
Yes.
And then let it be monitored by science. How do you think, Victor?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Huh? I've carried out 3 iron fertilization experiments. What you do in an iron fertilization experiment is you take a salt of iron, ferrous sulfate, which is a waste product of many industries, particularly the titanium industry, because they have to get rid of the sulfate. And the sulfate is best bound to iron, ferrous sulfate, because it's neutralized. And iron is the element which the planet is made out of iron. So there's no shortage. There will never, ever be a shortage of iron. You don't have to look for iron. It's everywhere. So this ferrous sulfate, it's also the pill that you get when you have anemia. I also had anemia. I was diagnosed with low iron levels after carrying out these experiments, so I wasn't contaminated either. So I had to take these pills, and it was ferrous sulfate. And we have a factory opposite here in Bremerhaven that produces 400,000 tons of ferrous sulfate every year. We need a few million tons, and there are 16 or 20 of these factories all over the world. So there's no shortage whatsoever of this ferrous sulfate that we would then add to revive the oceans, restore the oceans. The other thing is that what bothers me also a lot, and that I have worked on, is are the fish stocks in the ocean. The fish and whale stocks. There used to be enormous fish stocks. I'm living here in Bremerhaven, which was this region was part of the Hanseatic League, and it was the birthplace of capitalism, because the Hanseatic League was a league of merchants. The church was not involved, and the nobility were not involved. There were no king here. So whatever they did, whatever profits they got, they put back into the trade, right? So they built ships for transporting herring and cod. The amount of herring and cod in the ocean was unbelievable, and that's all gone now. We have stopped eating herring because the numbers have gone down. Cod has vanished from the North Sea, and they say it's the temperature. Rubbish, because further south there's still cod. So that's not it. It's overfishing. And in the time of the Hanseatic League, there was such huge fish stocks. The descriptions are, mind-boggling. They used to collect the herring with baskets from the shore. I mean, there are diagrams of people doing that, because the herring swarms were so big, they would push onto the shore, and the herring on the outskirts, they would be pushed out of the ocean. Can you imagine? Nobody can imagine that now, because that food is not there. The North Sea just does not have the food to feed herring stocks of that size. The same applies to the Southern Ocean when the whales were there, the great whales, the blue whales. The blue whales, the animal stock in the Southern Ocean at the time of the whales was the largest anywhere on the planet. We cannot imagine on a square meter basis how much animal biomass was there. Blue whales and the food they were eating, krill. That region where these whales were slaughtered during the 10s, 20s, and 30s of the last century, those regions are deserts now, because there's no iron. That's where we carried out the experiment. We went and mimicked a whale fertilizing the ocean with iron feces. The whales have liquid feces. So this liquid feces goes into the ocean, and then the phytoplankton, the plants in the ocean, the unicellular plants, they explode. They grow like mad. You get a big bloom. And that's when the krill moved in and ate that phytoplankton. right? So there's no way of bringing the whales back unless we start building up these phytoplankton stocks again. So we have, adding iron to the ocean is win, win, win all over the place. And there's no losing because, as I said at the beginning, that iron is not retained in the system. It's only retained in animals. The iron inside the animals, that can be recycled. But the iron that is leaked out can be taken up briefly, but then it's gone after that. So we have a lever in our hands with which we can restore the ocean, not only remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also restore the animal life. I mean, I would predict that we would be able to build up herring stocks and cod stocks again if we were to fertilize, and salmon stocks and so on, if we were to fertilize the ocean in a clever way. I mean, we're scientists. I mean, what are we supposed to be doing? But we are stopped by people who are scared. The Bedenkenträger I mentioned earlier. And that is maddening, when you see what could be done, what could be restored, and how we could bring the planet back. And, I share Peter's vision that we could restore the planet to what it used to be a few hundred years ago, at least, right?
So, Victor, if I can ask, if we did the iron fertilization near the North Sea or in that part of the Atlantic, how long would it take for the herring to come back?
Oh, no, that's complex because these herring stocks are, even in those days in the Hanseatic League also, there used to be these fluctuations. So when you have such gigantic stocks, then you naturally have fluctuations in them, which are also internal. They don't have to be environmental, right? But what we don't know is by how much other fish increase. There's so many other fish other than the herring. So it's a kind of seesaw. There are places where you have an anchovy and sardine seesaw. And
how long might it?
Pardon?
How long might it take?
Why, decades. I mean, within that, perhaps. I think that, if you think of the life cycles of the zooplankton, the fish, the food of the herring and the cod, I mean, like the krill has a life cycle of 6 years. So if we start fertilizing now, then we would see results fairly soon. And this would be so exciting because we would have the whole world watching what we're doing in the ocean. So it's not some kind of boring exercise. We would make this entirely transparent. We would have National Geographic would be invited. Everybody would come and film the whole thing happening. And we would learn so much. We would learn so much about the planet, how it functions. We would also develop once you know what power you have, potential power, you want to use it carefully, right?
Right.
And you become kind of, you're a steward, right? A caretaker. You're responsible, and this responsibility is not there amongst many of my colleagues, I have to say. They just want to brush things off and say, no, I don't want to engage with that. I just want to do this little work I'm doing now, which is, so sorry.
Victor, another question. People often say, well, what about the bad side effects of ocean fertilization? What's actually been observed? Because we've been doing ocean fertilization for about 1 million years, maybe 100 million.
But that's exactly it. We have, thanks for asking, we have hotspots in the ocean, like the islands, because the islands are leaching iron. That's it. So the rocks and the soil is very rich in iron, and so seawater washes iron off and rainwater and so on. And these are the islands which are teeming with animal life. There's seals lying on the shores. There are whales swimming around. I mean, small whales and so on, feeding. I mean, there's penguins in the Southern Ocean now, right? And toxic algae is what people come up with, right? This is one incident in the Gulf of St. Lawrence where a few people died probably from eating this contaminated mussels. But hundreds of people, thousands of people must have eaten the same mussels. Nothing happened to them. So, but these 3 people who passed away and another 100 who were affected but who recovered, they are taken as the excuse to not carry out any iron fertilization at all, because this particular species of diatom which has a particular compound called domoic acid, right, might do this harm. And the only other place where domoic acid has had an effect on animal life is off California with the sea lions. But the sea lion population is thriving. You have these blooms of these toxic algae all the time. And then occasionally you find seals that are afflicted lying on the beach, and the symptoms of domoic acid poisoning are extremely conspicuous because the animals get disoriented, which is why we know that this never happened in the past, because the symptoms are very clear. So there have been no incidences of human poisoning by domoic acid anywhere in the world outside of Prince Edward Island. It's called unleashing shellfish poisoning. So that's the proof that it's not if it were a danger, because these are natural phytoplankton, they grow everywhere. This particular ones that make the domoic acid, they're restricted to a few areas, and there's nothing has happened there.
And then with the 13 scientific tests, what observations have the scientists made about bad side effects?
They were far too short, the experiments, but in any case, nothing happened. I mean, the local phytoplankton that got the, like if you go in the desert and you start spraying water on the desert, whatever seeds are there, they will germinate. You're not going to get invasive plants, right? So they germinate, and that's what happens in the ocean. The local phytoplankton grow, they thrive. We had a big bloom of a genus of diatom, which is purported to secrete this domoic acid, and we had it, but there was no domoic acid. So this domoic acid has become a big scare story.
Yeah.
And I have to say that clearly now, because the evidence is so overwhelming, but it's not looked at, because if you find domoic acid anywhere, you write a paper on it. If you look at 3,000 regions where you take samples, there's no domoic acid, nobody published that paper. Domoic acid was not found. Let me just say, if I go in my garden and eat 10 of the leaves of the trees that are growing here, I'll probably also be poisoned.
Victor, you have been studying the ocean all your life, and you love the sea, as we can see. How should mankind deal with the oceans in the future?
We have brought the planet, including the oceans, to its knees. The ocean is empty, has been emptied. It's painful to see. We already, actually history is repeating itself, because we did that, humans did that to the planet on the land as well before. 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, we had wiped out the megafauna. There were elephants on all the continents except Australia. There were huge herds of animals everywhere, of herbivores, rhinos. Here in Europe where I'm sitting, there was enormous life. And then in the last 50 years, we've done that to the ocean. After the Second World, before that in the coastal areas, but now the open ocean also is depleted. So what we need to do is revive the ocean animal life, because the ocean animals play a much bigger role than the land animals, because the plants are very different. Right? The ocean is full of unicellular plants, which are droplets of protein, right? And on land, that protein is inside the leaf cells. I mean, there's comparatively little protein around available for the animals. There's a lot of infrastructure, which is cellulose and lignin. The ocean, on the other hand, functions very differently to the land. And it's the animals, the protein-based life, which is running the oceans. And on land, it's the cellulose and lignin-based life, which is running the land ecosystems. So we have to, first of all, understand that we have a different kind of ecosystem in front of us that we need to bring back up again, the way it was, the way the animals had developed the ocean ecosystems. So first of all, we need to understand the biology of the oceans. Well, there are not many people who, sorry, it sounds arrogant when I say that, who understand the biology, because they don't look at the life forms in the ocean, right? They rely on instruments to tell them what's there. And of course, how the instrument will only tell you what you tell it to do. It's like with AI, right? It's not going to find out anything new. So the oceans need to be nurtured back to life, and that can be done. That can be done if we have the caregiving attitude, the responsible attitude, accountability about what we are doing. And the other thing about the ocean is that you can remove stuff, kill stuff, but when you are bringing things back, you're not going to do much harm, because the iron, as I explained to you earlier, the iron is a lever that we have, which is easy to bring into the ocean, but it's also easy to stop. Because once you stop, everything goes back the way it was before. So that means we would have to continue this. No, we would have to continue playing steward of the ocean till the animal stocks are restored. And then they would run the system themselves. And then we could sit back and watch this happen. And I think that what we humans need to do, we need to go to those areas of the planet that are idling deserts today. And that's 40% of the ocean are subtropical gyres. These are exactly the places where the plastic is accumulating. So the plastic is accumulating because these are gigantic gyres that keep everything inside. And that water at the top has been at the surface for very long. So it's outpowered. I mean, it's impoverished. It has lost its nutrients. They have sunk out. So that water is clear and blue, and there's very little going on there. And those would be the places, the deserts of the ocean, that with irrigation, it's like the canals of the past 5,000 or 10,000 years. 10 is a bit too much, but let's say 5,000 years, like the Egyptian culture, the Mesopotamian culture, the Indus culture, and I come from India, so I relate very much to that. These were thriving societies that were sustainable. The Egyptian culture lasted for so long because they were getting the water from the Nile all the time, right? So, and nutrients also, right? Mesopotamian culture was also very stable. So we could build these kind of agricultural, aquacultural systems in the ocean by bringing in pipes. We would bring pipes in that would then bring deep water, the nutrient. The deep ocean is full of nutrients, and it's a limitless source of nutrients, right? So we could, like wells, right? We would be pumping up, we would not be pumping, it would run on its own through gravity by heat exchange. This is little details, but this can all be done. We can deploy these huge pipes in the ocean that would bring up this nutrient-rich water to the surface, and then we could be growing whatever we want to, in that nutrient-rich environment. We would have seaweed, but there would also be phytoplankton, all sorts of things. And these would be artificial ecosystems, but they would not affect the rest of the planet. On the contrary, they would take pressure off the rest of the planet, because we would be growing seafood there, and it's unlimited. These subtropical gyres are the most stable parts of the planet, because they will always be there. Everything can come and go, but the subtropical gyres will go on forever. So these are the places where we humans should now shift our activity. And these pipes I'm talking about, they would be made of the seaweed that we are going to cultivate. They would be like the trees. We would be inventing and planting trees in the ocean that did not evolve because the incentive and the possibility was not there. But now that we understand the ocean, how it functions, we can do that. So that's how, by making these pipes, deploying them, bringing up these nutrients, we could generate huge amounts of biomass, algal biomass, that could be harvested, compacted, and put away on the deep sea floor in these red abyssal clay plains, where we would be disturbing very little life. As I said, that's 38% of the planet's surface, which is just lying idle. So we could shift our attention from the periphery, right? At the moment we are exploiting the periphery, and go to the center, right? And develop our activity there. And that would be sustainable, everything. We would have jobs without end. And it's in the global south, subtropical gyres. So I have so many ideas about how the futuristic life on these ocean plains. We could grow fish, for instance, and store it in the deep sea floor, because things are very stable at the deep sea floor. and from there transport them, not on the surface. We would transport it then to the coasts at depth, right? So we wouldn't need cooling, and it would all be autonomous, and it would be self-sustaining. So that, this is, it's like, sometimes I feel a bit like Moses. This is a whole new part of the planet that we would then build up ourselves, and we would do it slowly, methodically. It would be like yoga on the high seas, right? And this would be very healthy jobs. Everything. I just don't see any kind of drawbacks. It can all be taken care of.
Yeah, we have one. We have to change our thinking. For this vision, we need another kind of thinking, a global one. We have to start to think as a one mankind, one family, right?
Yeah,
and
but
it's probably exactly the difficulty, right?
Yeah, well, the big issue I've seen, Andreas, is the news always wants to cover what's wrong. But and the way our brain works is whatever we pay attention to is where we're drawn. So in the northern climates, when I learned to drive, the driver instructor said, when you get into a skid on the snow, don't look at the tree you want to avoid, even though you're scared. Look down the road, because if you look down the road, you'll go there. If you look at the tree, you'll hit the tree. Our newspapers and news are pointing our direction at the tree, and we're headed straight there. And as Victor said, all we have to do is divert our vision to where we want to go. And again, that's the purpose of the book, and I'm so delighted that you've got the German version, because we just have to look there, and everything we need is there. It's not refined, we'll refine it, but we have to start looking, and then walking in that direction of restoring the climate.
So the answer to our initial question of whether we can restore the pre-industrial CO2 levels in the atmosphere seems to be yes.
Yes.
And we also know how to do that.
Yes. That's funny. It's that simple.
So we refer to your book, Peter.
As I mentioned in the book, the population. We know how to restore sustainable population, and it looks like I'm frozen. Oh, here we go. That we want a sustainable. We want the climate restored. We want a restored climate, and we want a sustainable population. Again, historically sustainable, which is the number of people under 40 being about what it was 100, 200 years ago. And it's scary at first, like, oh my gosh, how do we do that? But by the end of the century, almost everyone alive will have died natural deaths. And it's just a matter of how many births we have. And we're very good at having very low birth rates, and birth rates are plummeting. And all we need to do to get a sustainable population is look and say, oh, we're going to restore a sustainable population. And the young adults will just naturally, because they're humans, they'll naturally have the small families on average. And it's our job as the older guys and women to say we're heading to a sustainable population. And that there's a lot to be done, healthcare and family planning and so on. But the main thing is to direct our vision to where we're intent on going.
Yeah, vision is the word. Victor, Peter, thank you so much. We talked today with Professor Victor Smetacek, a German oceanographer, and Peter Fiekowsky, the author of the book Climate Restoration. I wish us all a future in peace and with a stable, healthy climate. All the best for the oceans, for all of nature, and for us who are part of that nature. Thank you so much.